We should probably do some sort of introduction. Like, hi, everybody. I'm Patricia.
I'm Lee.
And we're weird as fuck.
Yeah, I suppose you probably should, I guess, huh?
Yeah. Because someday we might be famous. Okay. So. All right. So everything sounds good?
Yep.
We good?
It's recording clearly.
It's recording clearly. You can hear our voices in all their glory. All our allergy filtered glory. The constant voice clearing, the attempts not to snort into the microphone.
Yep.
We are sexy creatures.
We are. Totally hot.
Okay. Now that everybody's left, we're going to talk today about an interesting phenomena. And there's two different definitions for this, and we're going to talk a little bit briefly about both of them. So this is the topic of shared death experiences. And we just watched that Netflix program, Surviving Death, which the first episode was awesome. Near-death experiences, people coming back. And then we got into mediumship, and I think they went off the rails real hard.
Yeah, it was a big pile of shit as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, that I wasn't convinced at all.
Yeah, it was all kind of bullshit.
But this part, the near-death experiences and shared death experience, I think they did a pretty good job of.
Yeah.
And I think it's a fascinating topic. And it's something that I've spoken to people personally who've had experience with this. So it kind of fascinated me. So there's two different ways to define shared death experiences. So there's either the experience of a sort of visitation by somebody who's recently departed, not a haunting. This is just kind of a flyby.
Hey, how's it going? I'm dead.
Hey, I'm dead. Nice knowing you. Moving on now. Or somebody who actually takes part in the experience of the physical and the spiritual separating. So, I've got anecdotal stories of both of those, so you can kind of understand them a little bit more clearly. But it's defined, according to the Shared Crossing Project, as the profound, sometimes life-changing event wherein a survivor feels as though they've been visited by or in some way touched by the spirit of the recently dead or dying. These experiences are cross-cultural, with accounts reported in every society on every continent, except for Antarctica.
It's too fucking cold there.
Well, I couldn't find any anecdotal stories from Antarctica. That doesn't mean that people there haven't experienced
They just don't
that
talk
phenomena.
about
It means that it hasn't been recorded.
Yeah.
As far back as we've recorded such things. These experiences could be part of what has driven the rise of religion, and giving us a brief glimpse of a possible world beyond our own and a higher power within it. End quotes. So it's a comforting idea, obviously. But the idea that we can communicate with those that we care about after they leave us, and that something is waiting for us at the end of this life, is it something that's factual, or is it wishful thinking on our parts? Because the idea of dying is terrifying.
Yeah.
You don't know what's there. Do you just blink and the lights are out? Or is there something outside of this existence waiting for us?
Well, that's what that show is about, and makes you think that there is something out there when you die, because they're all not afraid to die now, because they know what's going to happen when they do die. Right.
And, scientifically speaking, energy can't be destroyed. It just takes another form. So the idea that bit of us that makes us us is more than just a chemical process, that it's the energy that is what religions quantify as our soul, it would make sense that when this body deteriorates to the point where it's no longer of use for us, that energy becomes something else. It becomes part of something else.
Yeah. I hope so. Hope we're just not worm food and die.
Well, either way, you can't stop it.
No.
And if the lights do go out, at least you're not going somewhere in suffering and eternal torment because you were a dick on this planet.
Yeah, I've watched some of those that were.
Yeah, and that bothers me even more.
They didn't want to die. They didn't want to go back because it was a horrible fucking place. So,
yeah. Either way, repentance is probably a good idea, just in case. Now, I understand the idea of near-death experiences. Many scientific thinkers believe are just our brain's way of sheltering us from the horror of what's happening to our bodies. So the comforting euphoria, the light at the end of the tunnel, being visited by people that we care about, all that makes sense. But when you think of stories from children who've had near-death experiences and they claim to have been greeted by relatives that they couldn't have known about, great-grandparents that have passed long before they were ever born, I think that gives it a little bit more credence.
Yeah.
So millions of people, billions of people all over the world believe that there's something beyond this existence. And again, according to the researchers of the Shared Crossing Project, there's evidence that not only are near-death experiences, which they refer to as NDEs, and shared death experiences, which are SDEs, real. I'm just going to call it shared death experience. I tried to call it SDEs before when we recorded this, and it sounded like I was talking about venereal disease. So I'm just going with shared death experience. But they have, they point to the fact that not only could all of these people talking about the same things, when we have a billion witnesses, we have to think that there's something there. And this was before social media. This was before the rise of any media of any kind where people were able to share these accounts. People around the world have recorded this spontaneously, have recorded being visited by the spirits of the recently departed, recorded seeing something beyond themselves when they were in a position of potential death. Yeah, I did that the other day at my work. When the ambulance came for my coworker, I accidentally spilled my coffee just everywhere because I was startled by it.
Yes, she flings her hands around all the time when she talks. So
which is why we don't have a video, because I look like I'm trying to fly. If you don't have any audio, it's terrible. So according to them, if we look globally, these experiences have a number of things in common, which gives the whole idea of credence, because we've got people in outer Mongolia reporting the same sorts of experiences as people in downtown LA, which, you would think that culturally, and culturally there are some differences, obviously, but the core principles are remarkably similar. And that is a profound feeling of peace and joy, the glimpse into the afterlife, communication with those that have passed on, and an empathetic bond, a desire to connect with the soon-to-be or recently departed. So a profound feeling of peace of joy, that's pretty self-explanatory. Suddenly, the burdens of the world are no longer yours.
Yeah.
Which sounds incredibly appealing to me. A glimpse into the afterlife. So with a shared death experience, and we've got a couple of anecdotes here, people actually see what the departed is seeing.
That would be weird.
That would be wild. That would be real wild. And that's understandable in a near-death experience. If, you're in a situation where your body is failing and your brain is trying to protect it and you're seeing these visions, there's a lot of the hallmarks for a near-death experience that could be explained by a brain trying to protect itself, but not in a shared death experience. Why would, if I was standing at the bedside of a loved one while they're passing, why would I see that? And that's happened. We'll talk about that. Communication with those that have passed on. And that actually happened to my mom. And she and her dad had a really volatile relationship. When he was sober, she was daddy's girl. But my grandfather was in an accident in his, I want to say late 30s, early 40s, and he broke his neck and it never healed properly. And so he was in a lot of pain. And nowadays they'd have him addicted to opioids. No problem.
Yeah.
Back in those days, though, we're talking like the 60s, 50s, 60s, it was alcohol. And he wasn't a pleasant man when he was drinking. And so you had somebody who was in a lot of pain and who became volatile when he was drinking. And it was not a good situation for the family. He could be very abusive. So she had a really tough relationship with her dad. And when he passed away, right after he passed away, she was napping in the living room chair. Energetic person that she is. Well, you know, dealing with the death of a parent is stressful. And she swears that he came to her and that he was healthy and he was happy. And he told her how much he loved her. And they made peace as much as they could in that brief encounter. And when she woke up, she described those feelings of closure, of euphoria, and of certainty that this wasn't a dream. This was vivid. It was real. It was him, and he was there. And you know, she had that deep desire to reach out to him, but of course, you know, she couldn't because he was gone. Now, not every shared death experience or near-death experience has every one of these elements, but there's enough commonality to provide a strong case that this is a universal experience. So imagine not everybody who flies on an airplane has trouble clearing out their sinuses and popping their ears. Not everybody gets nauseous when the plane starts moving and wobbling around. But enough people do that we know that this is a real phenomena, right?
Yeah.
So this is the same thing. They're saying, you know, enough people have reported these same things that we believe that there's reason to consider this a real phenomena. So exactly, and this, I'm taking this directly from the Shared Crossings Project, because they put it together really concisely, and you know, it's kind of their job, so I want them to have credit for it, and also they've done a good job. So they ask, what exactly does a shared death experience look like? So that depends on how sensitive you are to these experiences and how the departed chooses to reveal themselves to you. So in Brian's case, Brian is a hardcore skeptic. He's not going to see dancing fairy lights. And even if he did experience a visitation like my mom did, he'd probably wake up questioning what he just saw and assuming it was a dream.
Yeah.
Whereas somebody who's a little bit more receptive to it might be willing to say, oh, wow, that was grandma. I swore for years after my grandmother passed away that I was going to turn around and she was going to be standing right next to me. The feeling of her presence was that strong. And my grandma and I were close. I loved my grandma, but we weren't that close. It wasn't like she was my constant companion. I had 2 very small children to deal with at that point. So I wasn't spending a lot of time thinking about how much I missed my grandma. So I couldn't chalk it up to that. Whereas if something were to happen to you, I would probably be thinking about it all the time. Your presence is everywhere in this house. There's your tools and your stuff, and we've done things in every room of this house together. So an awareness of your presence would be expected.
Yeah.
My grandmother was never in this house. She passed away before we bought this house. So the idea that I felt as though she were beside me was always kind of odd to me. But anyway, according to experiencers, there's a variety of ways that the dead choose to make themselves known to us. So remotely. And that's the most common form of a shared death experience, where the experiencer is physically distant from their dying loved one, like my mom was from her dad. They report dreaming of the patient at the time of their passing, or hearing, seeing, or smelling something that has a strong connection to the departed, combined with a surety that the departed is responsible for these connections. And, some of that can just be the way our minds work.
Yeah, some is just wishful thinking.
Well, think about it. When you were searching for your truck, you wanted to buy a diesel pickup. So everywhere you looked were diesel pickups, right?
Piece of shit, by the way.
It is not. It has a bad sensor. They're just trying to figure out which one it is.
For the third time.
Yeah, no, don't. When I bought my Volkswagen, suddenly bugs were everywhere. That's the way it works. So if this person is on your mind, of course, you're going to be more aware of the things that would remind you of them.
Yep.
A flyby. A brief visitation of the departed, sometimes with a message of love or gratitude for the time shared together. Which, again, kind of like what happened to my mom, only in this case, a flyby would be while you're awake and conscious. People have reported seeing the person that they loved. And again, that could be just because you see somebody that reminds you of that person. And it's not remarkable to me when it's immediately after that person's passing and you know that they've passed, because of course they're on your mind. But there's this story. You know who Loretta Lynn is? She's, country music singer. She reported that when her father passed, she was outside, she was working, and they didn't have a phone. This is back, like the 40s, I think, 50s. And she looked up and a neighbor was walking across the field. And she said when she looked up, it was her dad. And she knew her dad. She'd seen her dad walk home from the coal mines hundreds of times. She knew his cadence. She knew the way he carried himself. She said it was her dad. And in that moment, she knew he was dead. And that was the neighbor coming to tell her that she had a phone call, that she needed to speak to her mom. And her mom told her.
That would suck.
It would suck. And to me, stories like that have a little bit more credence, because there was no way, living as far away from her family as she did, with no phone, back then, no social media. It's not something that would have been on the news.
No, definitely not.
He was just a guy. He wasn't anybody that society considered of any, great import that we're going to be reporting on immediately that he's passed away. But she had that vision of him, and she knew in that moment that he was gone. So that would be an example of a flyby. And then there's bedside. So that would be those sitting at the bedside of the departed. And it's not unusual for people reporting feelings of peace and light prior to the end of the patient's life. And that could be chalked up to people saying, finally coming to terms with, they're going to die and I'm at peace with it. Grandma is sitting there and she's suffering and she's in a horrible state. And, I recognize that her body is failing and I'm at peace that it's finally time for her to go.
Yeah. Then we watched that TV show, and then it was like this one person was sitting beside the bed and actually felt their spirit go up with them.
Yeah, and that's actually
then bounced back.
That's actually, we've got a couple of stories like that, and those are the ones that give me a little bit more. When we're talking about just people's perceptions and just your internal feelings, we can chalk that up to, I think, the way that the human mind works. The way that we release our anxiety over a certain experience. But that, what you just mentioned, is the kind of shared death experience that is a little bit more interesting and a little bit harder to explain.
Yeah, because that person's perfectly healthy and all of a sudden is feeling the same things as the other person, which is weird.
Yeah, and you're just praying,
Like
God, let this be temporary.
Sucked up in there with them or something at the same time.
Let go, Earl, I'm staying.
I don't want to fucking die, man. Stop it.
And then one of the most uncommon experiences is one that involves multiple experiencers. So cases of multiple caregivers or family members experiencing the same phenomena at the same time while in the room with the dying patient.
That would be really weird to experience that when you're healthy and all of a sudden you're going through what they're doing.
Or there have been cases where multiple caregivers have seen what they described as beings of light hovering over the patient. Lights will get brighter. The room gets colder. They all suddenly have a feeling of lightness simultaneously. So that's a little harder to quantify when you don't have just one person sitting at the bedside saying, okay, it's time for you can go now. When you have multiple people who are feeling a variety of different emotions.
Yeah, it would be strange.
So they note 3 different ways that this happened. So early, delayed, or gradual. So early SDs, shared death experiences, not venereal disease, occur shortly before the time of death. So that would be those caregivers seeing that being of light, and then the patient passes. Delayed, so occurring shortly after the time of death, like what happened with my mom. It was really closely after my grandfather died that she experienced this visitation. Or gradual, so something that transpires over the course of several days. So what happened with my grandmother actually occurred over the course of several years. I'm not convinced that she's gone. I'm convinced that she's the one that keeps shaking the bed when you're in there by yourself, because she would think that was funny. Although my uncle might have done that too. My uncle who passed away, who was killed in the car accident.
Mm-hmm.
When we went camping, I was sleeping in my aunt and uncle's camper with them. The whole family was in this little camp trailer. And my uncle decided that the best way to wake us up in the morning was to shake the fuck out of it every morning at dawn.
Yeah.
I loved that man, but he was a dick.
A lot of your family likes everybody else to be awake when they wake up.
I know.
It's really fucked up.
Yeah, no.
For us that like to sleep in late.
Yeah, well, you don't get to sleep in late anymore. And how much does it annoy you when you need to go do things and Colin is camped out at like 2 p.m? So
it's a little annoying, but I don't feel the need to go wake him up when I wake up. I don't understand that philosophy at all. But
I never got it either.
As far as this afternoon and I gotta work on the car, I'm gonna fucking work on the car. And if he wakes up, oh fucking well.
Yeah. Well, he knows that I don't promise silence after afternoon. Sorry. I have things that I need to do. So we've talked about a couple of my own personal experiences, but we're certainly not alone in our experiences. And I grabbed a few from the internet, not just from Shared Crossings, but some really interesting ones that I thought you'd enjoy. So this one came from CNN. And William Peters was working as a volunteer in a hospice when he had a really strange encounter with a dying patient. He says the man's name was Ron, a former merchant marine afflicted with stomach cancer. He says that he would go and spend hours a day at the patient's bedside, which props to you. I mean, as a hospice nurse, that's like the hardest job on the planet, I think, because you're just there to provide palliative care. That person is going to die. You can't help them.
Yeah, what's up?
And to spend, hours providing comfort. I'm just, William Peters is a hero. That's all I have to say.
I dealt with way too much of that shit.
Yeah, I couldn't. My heart would break every day. So he didn't have many family and friends that would visit. So Peters sat by his bedside. He read him adventure stories that he liked and just chatted with him. Around lunchtime one day, the patient was semi-conscious, and Peters was reading a passage from The Call of the Wild by Jack London. He says that he felt a force jerk his spirit upward, and this might be the one that you're thinking about, and out of his body. He floated above the patient's bedside, looking down at the dying man and himself. Then he glanced to his side and saw the patient floating beside him, looking at the same scene below. He says, he looked at me and gave me this happy, contented look as if he was telling me, check this out.
Look at me.
He then felt his spirit drop back into his body. The experience was over in a flash. Ron died soon afterward. But Peter's questions about that day lingered. He didn't know what to call that moment, and he eventually learned that it wasn't unique, that he had shared in the patient's moment of death, a shared death experience.
It's not the same one, but that person in the show actually went up into the light and everything with that person. Got jerked up at the same time and went into what you would call heaven and then came back.
And so this is on Surviving Death on Netflix.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in what we're talking about.
Yeah, that was on Surviving Death. It was interesting. The first part was...
Yeah, I mean, they definitely had some really interesting... It was the mediumship ones that bothered me because there's so many of those people that take advantage of grieving families, and it makes me so angry. But there's also some really good stuff in there.
When they did research on all these people, they found out that they got
absolutely
all the information from the internet.
Was available on the internet.
But the stories of the death at the beginning is very interesting, and they don't seem like they're lying or they truly went through it.
And the stories of reincarnation. Yeah. When people who had the near-death experiences were talking about it, the way that they all spoke about it, it was just, there was just such a sense of excitement and a sense of peace about what they had experienced. It wasn't let me think about the story that I've made up. And you can tell when people are creating a story.
Yeah.
When they're telling you a tale that they've told many times versus somebody who's sharing with you an experience that changed them. And
yeah, it would be weird.
Anyway, back to our shared death experiences. We'll talk about near-death experiences. And one of the things that they covered in that show also was reincarnation. And they talked about a couple of the stories that I was going to cover in reincarnation, but they did not talk about the one that I think is the most compelling. And I want to share that one with you. You'll like it. It's interesting. Anyway, so this one came about during World War I. And this is a story of Karl Skala, a German poet. He was a soldier huddled in a foxhole during World War I, as most men of fighting age in Germany were.
They spent lots of time in the mud.
Yeah, he and his best friend were huddled in a foxhole when an artillery shell went off real close by. His friend was killed, which I don't even know how to express how devastating that would be to see your best friend blasted right next to you. Like, he felt his friend slump into his arms and die. In the book Parting Visions, Melvin Melrose described what happened next. Scala, aside from hearing loss, by the way, escaped injury, so his friend took the brunt of the damage from that shell. He says he felt himself being drawn up with his friend above their bodies and then above the battlefield. Scala could look down and see himself holding his friend. Then he looked up and saw a bright light and felt himself going toward it with his friend. Then he stopped and returned to his body. He was uninjured except for the hearing loss. So he started on his way and then decided, I should probably go back. Penny Sartori, who was a nurse for 21 years, said that she had a deathbed vision that left her shaken. One night, she was preparing to give a bath to a dying patient who was hooked up to a ventilator and other life-prolonging equipment. She says she touched the man's head and everything around us stopped. It was almost like I swapped places with him, she says. She could suddenly understand everything the man was going through, including his pain. He couldn't talk, but she says he could somehow hear him convey a heart-wrenching message. Leave me alone. Let me die. Just let me die. The shared death experience spurred her to conduct a 5-year investigation into such stories and published them in a book called The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences. But even before that experience, she said she and other hospital workers had other eerie portents that a patient was about to die. There would be a sudden drop in temperature at the bedside, or a light would surround the body just before death, she says. It's very common for a clock to stop at the moment of death. I've seen light bulbs flicker or blow at the moment of death. So if you consider us energy, the sudden release of that energy.
Yeah, that would be weird to experience all that shit.
So Annie Capp was born in the United States, but moved to England where she worked for a telecommunications company. On the day after Christmas, 2004, she says her mother, Betty, suddenly fell ill at home in her home in Portland, Oregon. She was hospitalized, and over the next few days, all of her major organs began to shut down. Cap, however, says she didn't know that her mother was dying. She learned that her mother was ill, but she couldn't get a flight during the holidays, so all she could do was wait. She was in her London office with a client when she started to gag, struggling to breathe. She was mystified because she said she was in good health. She struggled for air for about 25 minutes, and with a growing sense of dread regarding her mother. 25 minutes.
That's a long time.
That's a long time.
To do that.
I felt and heard this strange gurgling in my throat, she says. I started coughing and gagging, and I had this deep, growing sadness. I quickly rescheduled my client, and once they'd left, I ran as fast as I could to my house and called my mom. That's when she learned that her mother was gasping for air on the verge of death. While Cap was on the phone, she says her mother died. She's convinced that she somehow shared her mother's death throes, but she kept denying it because she was agnostic at the time and didn't believe in an afterlife. Now she says she does. She's a therapist in London, so no longer working for a telecommunications company, and the author of Beyond Goodbye, an extraordinary true story of a shared death experience. It wasn't a blissful experience, she says, of the day after Christmas. I was suffocating. So, yikes.
Yeah, that would not be a pleasant one to go through.
In this case, now we're getting kind of long, and I like to keep these at around a half an hour, so I'm going to paraphrase a lot of this. This young woman, Mary Fran, and her son Nolan were in a dreadful car accident, and Mary Fran was killed instantly. Nolan lingered for a while, and this friend of theirs, Scott Taylor, was at his bedside as he began to die. And he quotes it this way: "As Nolan's heartbeat patterns flattened and the monitor beside his bed sounded the constant, unwavering tone of organ failure, every member of his extended family wept, except for me. As he left his physical body for the last time, Mary Fran crossed the divide between the non-physical world and the physical world and scooped him out of his body. Their reunion embrace was exquisite. Then, to my surprise, Mary Fran and Nolan turned and included me in their embrace. Together, the three of us went into the light. I know of no English words for the combination of joy, ecstasy, love, and requited longing that burned within me. It carried me to a dimension I never knew existed. In that moment, there was no pain of loss, only unity, rapture, and reunion." So, and I've got a whole bunch others. Like I said, it's already 32 minutes in, and I don't want to go crazy on people. I'll have these all up on the website with links to all of the stories that I found, including the Shared Crossings Project, so people can research more. But it's the idea that not only can we have these drive-by sort of experiences where the departed comes to us and says, it's okay, I'm fine, but also we can in some way take part in that. Gives credence to the idea that there's something beyond this existence waiting for us.
Makes you wonder if some of the people get sucked up in there if they actually die and go. Well,
and you hear about that, people who've been together for a long time who die within just a little while of each other. Is it because you're elderly and you've passed on? Is it because your heart is just broken at the loss of this your life partner, or did they decide to take you with them and you decided that was fine, you were going to go?
Yeah, I don't know. Have to have somebody come back and say that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I can see dying and not wanting to go alone. I would like to think that I wouldn't be selfish and yank you out of your body and drag you along with me, whether you like to go or not. But I mean, it doesn't sound like any of the people who came back were necessarily dragged kicking and screaming.
No.
You know what I mean? So I think it's an interesting concept. It does make me consider, obviously, I've never had an experience like that, so I can't say, oh yes, there absolutely is an afterlife. I want to believe there is.
Yeah, we all hope there is.
Either that or there's just nothing. Just snuff it out because I don't want to be in some half place.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if that's what ghosts are that didn't quite make it.
Well, that's the theory. People who got trapped in this dimension and they're unable to interact with us in any meaningful way and they can't move on to the next.
Yeah, that would suck.
That would be torture. That's pure hell to me. To be so close. I mean, imagine. And now you know that I'm a social person, but conditionally. Social interaction exhausts me. And there's only so much I can take before I need to curl up in my little shell and stay there. But I require social interaction. I can't not be around people. It would drive me absolutely out of my mind. And to be so close to people and unable to interact with them would be insanely isolating.
Yeah, well, it suck. You would hope that they could meet other ghosts and hang out together.
Well, and that's, the interesting thing, I love the program Supernatural. That was one of my favorite shows the whole time it was on.
Yeah.
I've actually watched the entire run like 3 times now because I'm an absolute moron, whatever.
I just like the show.
But, they do take a lot of the lore from the show from, a variety of different places, including, anecdotal stories. And one of the writer's theories was that these hostile spirits are spirits that have been trapped between and they've gone mad.
Or they went out badly and they want revenge and that kind of stuff.
Well, if you're a hateful, angry person in this life, you're probably going to be a hateful, angry person in the next one. So, I can see that. But, it does make me wonder.
I mean, we've definitely had ghost experiences in this house. I mean, they're there.
Well, not just in this house, though. In other places that I've lived as well. But
a lot in this house when we had daycare. It was a lot of stuff.
Right. And there's also that theory that, spirit energy feeds off of the energy of the living. And who has more energy than 12 tiny
Bunch
people?
Of little fucking kids screaming and yelling everywhere.
Absolute madness. It was such chaos. I miss it so much.
And now it's quiet in the house. Ever since the kids have gone, I haven't had anything.
Nothing.
It's been quiet as hell. They're content and quiet now. They were pissed off and noisy before.
Just the one in the bathroom. The one that kept closing the door so that they would leave him alone. Anyway, that's shared death experiences. We'd love to know what you think. If you have any stories of your own, please send them to us. We'd love to share them.
Like us. Follow us.
He's going to say that until you do. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye. Want to stay connected between shows? You can find us on Instagram at WeirdAsFCKPodcast, on Twitter at WeirdAsFuckPod1, on Facebook at WeirdAsFCKPodcast. Send us an email at weirdasfckkpodcast@gmail.com. Or come on over to our website at www.weirdasfck.com. There you can check out our blog, pick up some merch, look over our sources, and even share your weird experiences. You might even make it on a future episode. We would love to hear from you. Until then, tune in and keep it weird.